On Wednesday the 3rd of November in 2021, a 40-year-old woman named Sheena Gibbs, a cancer survivor from Chicago's Rogers Park neighborhood, shared plans with her family about how she was due to travel to Davenport, Iowa, where her mother had been hospitalized. She promised to arrive the next day, but little did anyone know at the time that this would be the last official contact Sheena would have with her loved ones. 2 days later, Sheena was reportedly seen near the intersection of Greenleaf Avenue and Sheridan Road in Rogers Park, where a potential witness claimed to have spotted her in distress near a vehicle in the area, raising suspicions that something sinister may have occurred. But when Sheena failed to arrive in Iowa and stopped responding to calls, her family's concerns only deepened. Days turned into weeks, and with no sign of Sheena, Chicago police classified her as a high-risk missing person. The case then became even more chilling when activists pointed to a disturbing trend of missing black women in Chicago, a pattern often linked to the horrifying reality of human trafficking. But despite the search efforts of her family and the media attention they were able to conjure up with no thanks to the Chicago PD, more than 3 years later, Sheena remains a missing person, leaving her family desperate for answers as they are only left to wonder. What really happened to Sheena Gibbs? And could she be Chicago's next victim of human trafficking? Sheena Louise Gibbs was born in the year 1981 in the city of Davenport, Iowa, where she grew up surrounded by family that she cherished deeply, especially her mother, who she had a particularly close relationship with. Not too much is known about her childhood, but what we do know is that during her adolescence, Sheena would decide to move to the bright lights of Chicago, where she had intentions of pursuing a higher education at Truman College. But Sheena wasn't done there, as it wasn't long before she would set her sights on Northwestern University of Illinois, and eventually graduated with honors from Spoon River College, where she held the title of Vice President of the Student Senate during her time there. So it would be safe to say that Sheena was an incredibly driven person with her whole life ahead of her, and her family were extremely proud of the young woman for her achievements. However, at the age of just 25, her life would suddenly change forever, when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, which would seem to be a pivotal moment in her life's journey. But utilizing her positive attitude and driven personality, Sheena was able to beat her illness, and in an attempt to bring some further light into the world, she would then go on to become an advocate for others, channeling her strength into volunteering and social activism. During her 20-plus years in Chicago, she successfully volunteered for various organizations, where she would go on to raise funds for clean water in African villages, as well as taking the time to teach classes on ASL and HIV. So it would seem that this life-changing experience of battling cancer had given Sheena a certain level of dedication to helping others. However, as is the case with many other cancer survivors, behind her achievements laid struggles, as according to close friends, Sheena would go on to endure multiple abusive relationships, which friends say changed her for the worse. Her kind and nurturing nature was being taken advantage of, and after years of abuse, Sheena had transitioned from being the life of the party to somebody who was completely withdrawn, at times disappearing for months without contact. By June of 2021, Sheena had moved into an apartment with a new boyfriend, with many accounts suggesting underlying issues in their relationship similar to the ones before. One friend even recounted an instance where Sheena turned up at her door in tears, complaining about a fight she had had with her boyfriend. But in typical Sheena fashion, she eventually dusted herself off and returned to her home with the aim of making amends. And after texting her friend, it seemed that everything would be okay. However, this couldn't have been further from the truth, as later that very same year, Sheena would mysteriously vanish without a trace, on that fateful day in November. On Wednesday the 3rd of November, Sheena announced to her auntie Layla that she was planning on travelling back to Iowa to care for her mother, who at the time had recently been hospitalized for an unknown condition. The plan was to head back the following day, so Layla assumed that Sheena would be purchasing a bus ticket as she normally did when returning to Iowa. But strangely, not only did Sheena fail to purchase any bus tickets, but it appeared that she had also changed her mind about the day she was planning to leave, as a friend of Sheena's would receive a text on the 8th of November where she once again expressed her desire to travel back to Iowa to care for her struggling mother. However, just as before, no bus tickets were purchased, and according to close family, Sheena would never even step foot in the hospital, leading many to speculate that once again she was delaying her plans. But little did her family know at the time that Sheena was involved in a confusing relationship with an Uber driver from Chicago, who she would see relatively frequently when he offered her rides and took her out for dinners, a detail which would become extremely important in the following days. So, as time continued to pass, with no contact from Sheena, her family began to grow concerned for her well-being and started asking around her social circle for any information about where she could be. But unfortunately, nobody was able to provide any useful leads at first. That is, until one person finally came forward with information about a potential witness, the Uber driver she had befriended not too long before she disappeared. After learning who this person was, Sheena's family decided to confront him about what he knew, and during this conversation, it was revealed that he had been with Sheena on the 3rd of November, the very same day that she texted her auntie about her desire to travel back to Iowa. According to him, the pair had driven to multiple locations, including the Edgebrook Motel and the Greenleaf Hostel, where she was supposedly captured on surveillance cameras, which seemed to prove his story to be accurate. However, despite also telling the Uber driver that she was planning to head back to Iowa the following day, her credit card transactions showed that she had in fact checked out of the Greenleaf Hostel on November 5th, meaning there was a strong likelihood that somebody else picked her up that day. So, concerned that she may have been in serious danger, Sheena's family began to consider calling the police, as the last correspondence anybody had had with Sheena was on November 8th when she texted a friend about her failed plans to travel back to Iowa. So as Thanksgiving came and went, with still no contact from their loved one, Sheena's family finally decided to officially report her missing to the Chicago PD. On Wednesday the 15th of December, almost 3 weeks after Sheena was initially reported missing by her family, the Chicago Police Department finally issued a missing persons notice where they appealed to the public for any leads in the case. According to the family, this lack of urgency would be followed up by an extreme lack of interest from the Chicago PD, who seemed to be unwilling to help despite the disturbing circumstances of her case. When Sheena was initially reported missing, her family provided all of the evidence they were able to gather, including details about her ex-boyfriends and the Uber driver she was last seen with. But despite this wealth of useful information, the police didn't seem to act, as witnesses remained unchecked, giving potential suspects a chance to clean up any trails. A key detail that Sheena's family provided was that during their personal investigations, they watched the surveillance camera footage of Sheena leaving the Greenleaf Hostel on November 5th, but by the time police officers finally travelled over to the location to check for evidence, the footage had been deleted, leaving Sheena's family distraught as a key piece of evidence was no longer available. Another strong lead that the family had been working on was the idea that Sheena's abusive ex-boyfriend may have been responsible, as he had an affiliation with convicted human traffickers as well as a record of his abusive behaviour. However, despite being given this chilling information, once again, the police were slow to act, as by the time they spoke to this potential suspect, there was no hard evidence to link him to the case, and they were satisfied with his statements, where he explained how he had kicked Sheena out of the apartment they shared well before the day of her disappearance, and how he had not been in contact with her ever since. So this was apparently the last time they spoke to Sheena's ex-boyfriend, a man who had strong ties to human trafficking and a history of physical abuse towards his partners. But the controversy didn't stop there, as on top of their reluctance to follow up with any credible leads, the police also refused to dig into Sheena's phone records until 7 months had passed, a decision which would soon reveal itself to be a grave mistake, as what they would find during their investigation would unveil a chilling detail that nobody saw coming. On Tuesday the 18th of January, around 2 months after Sheena was first reported missing, the police finally upgraded Sheena's case to a high risk, as they were able to admit for the first time there was a danger that she may have been at risk of injury or death. But despite this massive change in the case, they would continue to hold off on checking any phone records until 5 months later, in June of 2022, where they were pressured by the family to find out where Sheena's phone had last pinged. During this part of the investigation, nobody knew what to expect exactly, as there was a chance that by revealing the phone records, Sheena's family would learn that their loved one had been voluntarily keeping to herself for all this time. But what the police would soon find would blow this theory out the water, as Sheena's cell phone location had gone cold after November 10th, where it pinged at a harbour near Chicago. According to reports, the investigators were able to track that Sheena's cell phone had in fact been at the Greenleaf Hostel on November 5th, but later that day it had travelled over to the city of Evanston, which was about a 10-minute drive from the hostel on Sheridan Street. From here, the phone remained in this location until 5 days later, on November 10th, when it once again moved, this time to a place called Winthrop Harbour, which was about an hour's drive north of Evanston. However, just like before, the Chicago PD were incredibly slow to capitalise on this information, as they would wait a further 3 months before finally sending officers out to Winthrop Harbour to conduct a search of the premises. But just as Sheena's family feared, the police had waited too long, as by the time they arrived on the scene, there was absolutely no evidence of Sheena's cell phone or any information that linked back to the case. So once again, a strong lead had crumbled to dust due to the delayed response of the authorities. But despite this tragic update in the case, there would still be one last twist to the tale, as Sheena's family would refuse to give up in their search for the truth, revealing one last piece of evidence that would reinvigorate the cold case. On Sunday the 24th of September, almost 2 years after Sheena was initially reported missing, her case was featured on the television show Disappeared on episode 5 of their 11th season, with the aim of bringing some renewed attention to Sheena's troubling case. In this episode, the Chicago PD were vilified in response to their lack of urgency in the initial stages of the investigation, and the details surrounding Sheena's ex-boyfriend seemed to particularly resonate with the audience, due to the mention of his abusive behaviour in the past. As a result of this broadcast, potential leads began to flood in, which is when the family would learn about just how strong these ties were between Sheena's ex-boyfriend and his human trafficker friends. It was also revealed that Sheena had confided in a friend that she wasn't just leaving Chicago to be with her mother, but also as a means of escaping the clutches of her abusive ex-boyfriend. This detail then led Sheena's family to reaffirm their beliefs that he was involved in her disappearance, and posts were made on social media to spread this theory in the hopes that it would gain traction within the Chicago Police Department. However, despite the red flags that continued to persist around this suspect, the Chicago PD still refused to name any suspects in the case, and as far as we know, to this day they have still not interviewed Sheena's ex-boyfriend a second time. So, after 3 years of intense searching and investigating by Sheena's family and friends, as well as those who were particularly affected by her story, she remains a missing person to this day, meaning that for now, we can only continue to help spread her story in the hopes that we will one day find out what really happened to Sheena Gibbs. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But thanks to the continued dedication of Sheena's family, her case still remains alive in the media, with YouTube channels such as Black Girl Gone posting updates to the case as new evidence comes to light. So with this in mind, we have to stay positive that it will only be a matter of time before the truth is revealed, providing Sheena's family with the answers they deserve, and maybe even leading them to reunite with their loved one against all odds. However, given that Sheena Gibbs has now been missing for over 3 years, despite the devoted efforts of her family, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of her safe return is only growing weaker as time passes. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I get into the theories themselves, I just wanted to take a moment to quickly acknowledge Sheena's family who have worked so hard to keep her case in the spotlight. If you're watching this, then I sincerely hope I did Sheena's story justice, and please feel free to reach out to me if you would like me to report on any further evidence or updates to the story as it progresses. At this point in the video, I usually rattle off a few theories about what could have happened to the missing person in an attempt to bring more attention to the case. But I do understand that these theories can be distressing to hear, especially if you are close to the victim. So I will try my best to be as respectful as possible by refraining from going into any painful details. So with this in mind, one theory which I think stands above the rest is the idea that Sheena was unfortunately met with foul play. I know there is technically not any concrete proof to back this up, but the amount of circumstantial evidence linked to the case seems to point in this direction, and given the Chicago PD's failure to take the case seriously, I can't help but feel that they would have likely discovered tons of hard evidence if only they had started looking sooner. The mention of Sheena's abusive ex-boyfriend is particularly concerning, and given that his property was never extensively searched by the police, and he was given several weeks between the disappearance and his interview, there is a very good chance he could have been involved with the case and simply covered his tracks. After all, it's not like the police dug very deep when looking into him as a potential suspect, so I would certainly not rule out the idea that he could be responsible. With his abusive history, all it would have taken was an argument that went too far to explain why Sheena has never been seen since. Another key detail related to the ex-boyfriend was the fact that he had friends who were previously convicted of human trafficking. In my opinion, there is a very strong possibility that he was responsible for getting her involved with a human trafficking ring, especially given the fact that she was seen travelling to multiple hotels during her final days, which is behaviour typically associated with victims of human trafficking. It's possible that Sheena didn't know what she'd got herself into before it was too late, or maybe she was physically coerced into this life. There is just no way of saying for certain at this time. But I truly hope this is an angle that the police eventually look into, as to say that human trafficking is a problem in Chicago would be a huge understatement, to say the least. In the year of 2021, the same year that Sheena disappeared, Homeland Security investigators revealed that human trafficking arrests across the country had increased to 2,360 from 1,746 the previous year, with only 728 victims being identified and assisted. This is despite figures of around 16,000 to 25,000 women and girls who are estimated to be trafficked every year in Chicago alone, at least according to Refugee for Women Chicago. This organisation explains that the reason for Chicago being such a hotbed for human trafficking is that there are several available transit routes nearby, such as international airports, waterways and busy streets. There is also a lot of tourism to the area, so there is a large customer base who choose to use these services despite the potential consequences. The business is also incredibly lucrative for those who run these underground operations, due to the absence of taxes and the high price they can charge for these illegal services. In addition, it is also estimated that around 87% of Chicago residents believe that it is the victim's choice to enter these environments, so it's no surprise that the police are choosing to turn a blind eye to so many missing person cases involving women. But before I get too carried away, I must make it clear that I'm not explicitly saying that Sheena Gibbs is therefore a victim of human trafficking, as if this were the case, you would think that after 3 years of searching she would have found a way of contacting her family by now. However, there is always the possibility that something happened to her as a result of her possible affiliation with the dark practice, especially given the fact that her ex-boyfriend was linked to convicted human traffickers, and he was an abusive partner, so I feel it's an important theory to discuss nonetheless. But if for argument's sake, Sheena wasn't the victim of foul play or human trafficking, what else could explain her strange and sudden disappearance? Well, one angle which has been discussed online is the idea that Sheena could have chosen to leave her old life behind in an attempt to start fresh in a new town. This theory is based on the fact that Sheena had been struggling with her relationships and still had some lingering issues as a result of her traumatic cancer diagnosis when she was just 25 years old. So this, coupled with the news that her mother had been hospitalized, may have been the reason why she could have decided to leave on her own accord. But to take a slightly darker route, it is also being discussed that since her cell phone had last pinged at the Winthrop Harbour, it's also possible that she somehow ended up in the water. whether by accident or intentionally. However, since the police took so long to investigate this lead, there is a very high chance that if Sheena did lose her life that day, we will never be able to uncover the truth, and that for me is one of the most troubling aspects of this theory and of this entire case as a whole. There has also been no concrete evidence to support any of these theories, and the police refuse to name any suspects despite the huge wealth of incriminating information they have at their disposal. So unfortunately, for now, we can only continue to speculate on what happened that day. The difficult reality of Sheena's disappearance is that after 3 years of searching, her family are still no closer to finding out what really happened. So with this in mind, we have to do everything we can to help share her story with the world, as with enough support, I truly believe we can help bring this case to a close, and in doing so, provide some much needed closure to a family who have worked so hard for justice. Anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here. But as always, if you have any other theories of your own which you think may help explain what really happened to Sheena Gibbs, please leave your ideas in the comments down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. But until next time, thank you so much for watching and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these stories. Also, if you found this story interesting, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now, which covers the many other cases of women of colour who continue to go missing in recent years, all of which have suspiciously strong ties to the dark practice of human trafficking.